Hello and welcome to the Fascinated by Fungi podcast. I'm Dr. Gordon Walker, and today we're going to talk about mushroom toxins and allergens. And this is an incredibly deep and complex subject that I've been in the weeds researching for the last couple of hours and realizing that, maybe I need more than just a couple of days of research to really address all of the different toxins and allergens that are present in mushrooms, because I start going down the rabbit hole of looking at the toxins in mushrooms, and immediately I get turned on to mycotoxins in the entire world of small molecules and toxic things produced by molds and other types of fungi. And that is just absolutely mind-boggling how many things out there made by different fungal organisms that can actually harm us and potentially be very, very toxic or carcinogenic. But today I'm going to try to mostly focus on the toxins that we're finding in mushrooms specifically, and things that we consider toxic mushrooms, but also kind of tending towards the idea that while there are some things that are very definitively toxic, there are some things that are present even in edible mushrooms that can be toxic to us depending on the concentration and the form in which we consume them. So I want to kind of talk to you guys generally about all of these types of toxins that do occur in mushrooms, some examples of the types of toxicity, some of the mechanisms for how they make you sick, the types of sort of health consequences you can have from consuming these things, and then I'm going to go over at the end some examples of mushrooms and the toxins they contain, and maybe ways you can be careful kind of operating in the foraging space when you know there's things out there that can hurt you. But I think one thing I want to address is last week's Morel podcast. I actually forgot. I realized as soon as I signed off, I was like, oh, shucks, I had a whole other thing I wanted to talk about, and that was Morel Cultivation. And so I'm going to just quickly spend a few minutes talking about Morel Cultivation here in this episode, and then we'll jump into the toxicity part of what I want to talk about. So Morel Cultivation is generally very, very difficult to accomplish. Because what I talked about in terms of life cycle of them often wanting to be endophytic inside of a plant and then transition to the saprobic thing and kind of growing a sclerotia and needing very specific environmental conditions to go ahead and fruit. And so there are sort of two main groups of people who say they've figured this out. There's a group in China and a group in the Netherlands that have both kind of figured out how to cultivate Morchella, true morels, in a greenhouse, and they're controlling, I believe, the strain, the type of morel they're using. They are controlling the CO2, the humidity, and the nutrients, and maybe even the microbiome, because I found quite a few papers that were talking about how the microbiome, the presence of different fungal and partners and bacteria, could very much affect how the morel fruited, whether it was a big one or a small one, and if it would fruit at all. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, is that so often when we look at putting things in culture and kind of growing them, we're often doing it completely in isolation. But fungi don't exist in isolation. They exist as part of complex microbial communities where there's a lot of crosstalk between the plants and the fungi and then all the bacteria that can be inside of and working cooperatively or antagonistically against these organisms. And so very much like ourselves, we're a composite organism of all the bacteria that's inside of us, and our health consequences are very much influenced by what's going on in our microbiome in our guts, and then how we feed that, the nutrients we consume, and how that affects the microbial diversity of our guts. That's the same for morels. And so I think in these situations where people have learned how to cultivate morels inside, it's a very careful dialing in of the types of conditions they need that will foster a good microbial environment, the nutrients that they need to actually get them to fruit, probably the temperature conditions, the soil pH, a lot of things that go into this. But what I will say is generally, if you're trying to cultivate morels at home, you're not going to have a lot of luck. You can buy morel spawn. I would avoid buying it from anyone who calls it morel seeds, because that is most likely a scam. And I think a lot of people selling morel cultivation kits are kind of scamming you, because there's a chance it will work, but there's a better chance it won't. And that's because you're not controlling all of the very specific factors of pH and nutrients and CO2 level and all that kind of stuff. If you do look at some of the literature that exists, I think Tom Volk has published a patent where he talked about ways that he got it to work for him in a specific environment with his specific strain. Again, this hasn't been scaled up commercially in the United States because I think it's been too inconsistent. I talked with some people from Mycopia, gourmet mushrooms, that had been sort of prototyping, testing, growing some morels, and I believe they were using kind of the landscape morel type one, the one that's truly saprobic, and they were having some limited success. And I tried some and it was good, but I haven't seen those being made available commercially. So I'm still kind of skeptical that we will see large-scale morel cultivation happening here in the United States. But I do hope it happens eventually because it would be really nice to buy morels year-round and have a slightly lower price. Although I do think kind of the magic of morels is very much in the fact that they are wild and you have to go out and forage them, and they're sort of seasonal and ephemeral, and that makes them very special. So there's my little 2 cents on morel cultivation. Now we're going to jump into mushroom toxins and allergens. And I might have to do a second episode on this because it's such a broad subject and there's like so much to cover from kind of a biochemical perspective, an ecological perspective, human health and toxicity perspective. So I'm going to just do what I can and we'll talk about this for a little while, and if I feel like I need to do a second episode, I will. So one of the first things I want to introduce the idea of is fungal secondary metabolites. And I've been writing chapter 5 of my book where I'm trying to jump into mushroom biochemistry, and I'm talking about edibility, toxicity, medicinal value, and a lot of this stuff as to whether it's edible, medicinal, or toxic is going to be dependent on these fungal secondary metabolites. So primary metabolites are things in our bodies and in fungal cells that are basically just how the organism is making energy. So we as humans do oxidative metabolism. We break down sugars into smaller molecules, and every time we're kind of breaking it down and transforming it, we're pulling off little bits of energy, producing ATP, which is sort of like energy money, which we then use to run our cells. Fungi are similar. All of the same core metabolic processes in fungi are basically the same core metabolic processes we use because we're both doing oxidative metabolism for a lot of our lives. The secondary metabolites are sort of the offshoots of those primary metabolites. It's usually more complex molecules that require more enzymes, more biosynthetic steps to produce a molecule. And those molecules are energetically costly, but sometimes the fungi are making them to detoxify something, to affect the kind of intracellular environment because they're changing like the redox status, the sort of probability of different types of reactions happening within the cell. And sometimes they're producing these secondary metabolites, often they're producing these secondary metabolites as ways to interact with their environment. Because I've talked about before, fungi, unlike animals, can't move for the most part. So they're kind of stuck in their substrate, they're stuck in their food, and they're stuck with anyone that is trying to compete with them, or bacteria that are preying upon them, fungi that are trying to mess with them. So they produce these secondary metabolites as communication molecules, as signaling molecules, as sort of ecological mediators where fungi can like physically and literally transform the environment around them from a biochemical standpoint to change what other kinds of organisms are doing. And it can kind of like manipulate the behavior of other fungi and bacteria depending on the kinds of molecules it's making. So that's part of why fungi have such a plethora of cool enzymes, because they are using these biosynthetic pathways to produce secondary metabolites to fundamentally alter their relationships to plants and fungi and bacteria. And then that is influencing the ecological role of that fungi and how it interacts. So that is the basis of what a lot of the things I'm going to talk about here that are mushroom toxins or allergens. These are secondary metabolites produced by fungal metabolism. And it's not always clear why they produce these secondary metabolites. Some of these things we understand kind of ecologically, and we can see like, okay, look, this polyketide makes plants do this, and so that's, we've hypothesized that's why it does this. But there's some other stuff like the production of psilocybin, which is an alkaloid produced by lots of different kinds of fungi, notably from psilocybe mushrooms. We don't really totally understand why they make it. And it's interesting to us because humans find psilocin, a very compelling entheogenic alkaloid, and we, I think, want to understand why fungi make it, but we don't entirely do. And it's been hypothesized that maybe it's an antioxidant, and it's also been hypothesized that maybe it was something produced by fungi to somehow like enhance human evolution. And I think that's kind of an absurd concept. The stoned ape theorem is something that was clearly come up with by a stoned ape, if you get my drift. But it is interesting to look at the way that fungi may recruit animal partners or discourage animal partners, depending on the different types of secondary metabolites and toxins that they're producing. So where's the idea of kind of secondary metabolites as kind of the core of what fungal toxins are? And I'm going to go over in a fairly general sense and try to give a few examples here of what some of the general classes of mushroom toxins are. So there are proteins or peptides that are produced by the fungi. And again, I'm mostly talking about mushrooms here, but I will reference some other non-mushroom fungi. Some really classic examples is stuff like amatoxins, which are these cyclic small peptides, and proteins and peptides are basically the same thing. Peptides tend to be smaller, and proteins are larger, but they're both just strings of amino acids where you have like a primary structure of just the amino acid sequence, and then it folds into either beta sheets, which are kind of like folded compressed sheets, or little helical alpha helices, or some other things. And those are all kind of like lumped together based on hydrophobicity, where like the inside of the protein is fairly like hydrophobic, it doesn't want to be near water, and then the outsides of the protein are more polar and are soluble in water. But again, that can depend on whether you have an intramembrane protein or not. And we don't need to get into biochemistry and protein folding. That's another episode. Amatoxins are small. They're super stable, which means they can survive cooking, and they're very, very toxic. So I'll talk about those a little bit later. But there's some other ones that are less toxic, like osteolysine, which is pretty common in oyster mushrooms, and it can be toxic to red blood cells if you consume oyster mushrooms raw, but if you cook it, it's heat liable, so it breaks down. And that's kind of a point I'm going to come back to again and again when I'm talking about toxins and allergens here, is frequently a lot of the stuff in fungi that could be problematic for us as humans can be mitigated by cooking it. And this is similar to plants. There's a lot of plants that if you ate them raw would be very problematic for you, but because we cook them or because we prepare them in certain ways, they're safe. And I think that's a thing that people need to remember about fungi is while there are plenty of toxic mushrooms, the overall number of toxic mushrooms is very small. And the incidence of toxic mushroom poisoning is fairly low, as is the number of people with allergies. But that being said, it's really good to understand what the toxins are, what the toxic species are, and what the potential effects are, because once you get into this stuff, you realize that it's complicated. And just in the same way that allergies to plants and other foods are complicated, it can be very complicated when it comes to mushrooms. So I'm, again, not trying to pretend like I understand all of this. I certainly don't, but I'm just trying to give you sort of a broad overview of stuff. So we have the proteins and peptides. Makes sense that fungi would be making those. There's also like glycoproteins or sugars attached to proteins. There's amino acids and amino acid derivatives. So these are, we have 20 essential amino acids that we as humans need. And I think there's like 12 of them that we can't synthesize and we have to get from our food. And there's another 8 we can kind of like make from the backbones of other ones. But fungi and mushrooms use a different set of amino acids where they have some sort of non-standard ones that are included in their metabolism. And they're not always used to produce proteins. Sometimes they're just like other signaling molecules and metabolites that are present. But there's stuff like alenic norleucine, which can make you quite sick. That's in Amanita smithii, but that's something that's in mushrooms that can make us sick. We have also like lots of histidine and histidine derivatives, stuff like ergothionine, which is pretty high in Shiitake and oyster mushrooms, and it's a compound that's actually sold as a nutritional supplement. But I think it can like do weird things to your blood pressure, and ergothioneine can also like build up in our bodies, and for people who don't have the right enzymes for processing it, can end up being fairly toxic and or inducing allergic responses. And that's very dependent again on your like health history and the genetic background and your sort of epigenetic history of where you've been health wise. There's nucleotides, so this is like the bases of DNA, and there's different nucleotide derivatives that you can make in fungi, and they do lots of them. But fungi in general are pretty high in stuff like uric acid, uracil, and if you don't break that down with enough heat, you can consume too much uric acid and actually cause a kind of weird form of arthritis called gout, where you end up with a lot of uric acid crystals in the joints of your toes and stuff like that, and you have trouble walking, and your foot swells up, and it's really painful. It's a good reason to avoid eating too many really rich vegetables and things that have high uric acid content, although if you eat a fairly balanced diet, it's not usually an issue for people. There's also like pyrimidine derivatives and some other sort of, just fungi have this huge set of cool enzymes. But because of that, they're able to make some pretty weird stuff. And again, cooking can help mitigate a lot of these things. But if you're not careful with your cooking, or you're trying some weird fungal things, or you just have particular health issues, it can predispose you to being sensitive to some of these compounds. We have alkaloids. So I mentioned psilocin, psilocybin. Those are pretty famous ones. I did a whole episode. I think it was episode 7 if you want to listen to me talk about psilocybe mushrooms. There's ergot alkaloids, so those are things like from the ergot fungus that grows on wheat, or I think maybe it's rye. Either way, it's a precursor to lysergenic acid, LSD, and it can cause some pretty weird things. It's been sort of historically reported that the Salem witch trials were caused by a really bad bout of ergotism, where there was a lot of ergot infected rye, and it was like a poor harvest, so they were eating mostly like heavy rye breads. And I think something too was predisposed to like women being affected by this, and that's part of why the Salem witch trials happened. It was just a really bad bout of food poisoning, basically. Muscimol is the famous component that's in Amanita muscaria. That's also an alkaloid. You have organic acids like acromelic acid and norcapratic acid. You're going to hear me say a lot of things that I don't totally know how to pronounce today, and that'll be fun. But the acromelic acids in Chlorocrotylglycine, can't say that one. Anyhow, it kind of can mess with neurological function, and has a lot of impacts on glutamic acid receptors and stuff like that. So these are just organic acids that can cause issues for your metabolism. The norcapratic acid is one that's in Turbinellus woolly chanterelle mushrooms, and it's not inherently toxic unless you have a lot of it. And so I'm going to talk about this idea too, that some things we can eat small amounts of certain things and be totally fine, but if we eat large amounts of it over a sustained period of time, it can become toxic, build up in our system, and cause issues for us. There's sesquiterpenes, which is a very complex family of molecules that includes a lot of mycotoxins. There's type A and B mycotoxins, but these are very, very carcinogenic molecules produced by a lot of different kinds of soil bacteria. So Aspergillus and Fusarium are famous for producing a lot of these very carcinogenic mycotoxins. And this is a big issue for food production. And these are things that, like, the reason we have an FDA is because they require food companies to test stuff like peanut butters is renowned for having a fair amount of mycotoxin in it, and having allowable limits for food as to like what's safe. And arguably there's really no safe amount of these mycotoxins to consume. But again, we can look at like the LD50 and the types of damage and stuff that occur with this, and set reasonable levels. Because if you said no, then like all peanut butter would basically be off the shelf, but we're able to like choose particular levels of things, and also do food processing techniques to kind of mitigate this stuff. And I'll do a whole separate episode on mycotoxins another time. But also generally what I'm talking about, everything here is a mycotoxin, so it's kind of confusing because like all the fungal Toxins technically count as mycotoxins, but if you look it up, usually a lot of these fungal toxins and poisons are sort of differentiated from mycotoxins, which are generally specifically produced by like molds like Fusarium, Aspergillus, Mucor, stuff like that. There are potentially toxic, at least allergenic carbohydrates and polysaccharides. So chitin is like one of the polysaccharides that's in fungal cell walls, and that can make people sick. People have allergies to chitin. Some people who have an allergy to shellfish would also have an allergy to mushrooms if they're allergic to chitin. Chitin is just a long polysaccharide, pretty similar to like cellulose, but it has nitrogen in it. That's what's part of what's in cell walls of fungi. There's one like lentinan, which is component beta-1,3-glucan in Shiitake mushrooms. That can cause people all sorts of issues if you don't cook it enough. There's hydrazines like geromithrin or monomethylhydrazine, which is in geromithra, it's in helvella, it's in a lot of ascomycete fungi, it's even in morels at low levels, which is why you want to cook morels well. There's also agarotine, which is a phenylhydrazine, which is in a lot of Agaricus species, including Agaricus by Spores, but again, not really at a high enough level for you to be concerned about, despite what some people have said, sort of being alarmist to the contrary. You can look up literature that says that eating a little bit of raw Agaricus by Spores is fine for you. There's fatty acids, oxylipins, sterols, things that are all, again, components of fungal cell membranes that can affect us biologically. And this is a lot of this episode is kind of going back to stuff I talked about in the medicinal mushroom podcast, or as referencing some of the bioactive molecules. And all of these molecules I'm talking about are bioactive molecules. Some of them, in certain contexts, aren't necessarily toxic. They can be medicines. Even the most deadly amatoxins that I talked about can be medicines if you deliver them specifically to certain tissues at very specific concentrations and dosages. You know, you could use amatoxins to kill cancer cells, but if you accidentally eat an amanita at the dinner table, you could end up dead. And so a lot of this understanding of toxicity is having an idea of like what the mechanism is, and then like how we consume it, how we might like approach it in sort of a reasonable manner that allows us to kind of understand it and put it in context. So let's see, what else I have on here? It's more stuff about mycotoxins. So it's polyketides, sesquiterpenes, peptides, lactones, cyclobutanes. It gets real complicated. I'll do more episodes on this because like the chemistry of this stuff is just kind of mind blowing, and it's also hard to like talk to you guys about all these different classes of molecules without being able to kind of show you pictures and examples of these things. But I'm going to talk now a little bit about like the types of toxicity, toxin types, and then some examples here of mushrooms that do contain toxins that you need to be aware of. So when we're thinking about mushroom toxicity and even like an allergic reaction, you want to think about like an acute reaction or acute toxicity where you eat something and usually within like 30 minutes to, let's say, 3 hours or something like that, you have a fairly visceral reaction where your stomach hurts, or maybe you're sweaty, feeling nauseous, that kind of thing. That's generally kind of acute toxicity. And there's delayed toxicity, where you ate it and then something more like 6 to 8 hours later, even up to like 2-3 days later, you might start feeling ill. And that would be a more difficult one because you don't necessarily associate that with the mushroom that you just ate. Whereas if you start feeling bad right after a meal, it's pretty easy to understand you just ate something bad. And then there's also chronic toxicity, where maybe you don't notice something initially, but over a period of time, you start to experience symptoms because you continue to expose yourself to a toxin or something in food that is not good for you. And so I think in some ways sort of the acute toxicity is the one that people think of the most, but the sort of scarier ones would be like the delayed toxicity or this chronic toxicity, because you could have consumed something and not realize that it's really impacting your body until a later point in time. And with a lot of this toxicity, if you want to deal with it from a medical perspective, you want to go in and deal with it right away. If you suspect you've been poisoned, you want to call poison control and do something about it right away and not wait like a week until you have really bad symptoms, because that by then the damage is often done. So in terms of the toxicity of all the things I mentioned, you can have like a genetic predisposition. So there's actually like one particular gene that's associated with people being unable to handle some of the kind of unusual amino acids in common edible mushrooms. You have stuff about your own personal health history. So generally, a lot of the things I was looking up in terms of like toxicity of mushrooms, it was hitting people who had kidney issues or liver issues the hardest, because though our kidney and our livers are what is doing detoxification in our bodies. And so if you have impaired renal function, kidney function, then you're much more at risk for being impacted by some of these mycotoxins and fungal toxins. Your microbiome, the specific makeup of bacteria in your gut, can influence how these things impact you. Again, some people who probably eat a lot of mushrooms and maybe eat a lot of shellfish and stuff like that have bacteria that can digest chitin and they don't have an issue with it, but someone else who like rarely if ever eats these foods might get exposed and have an allergic reaction because their microbiome isn't kind of keyed in to dealing with these molecules. There's I talked about like kidney and liver health, like how well your body is able to deal with toxins and detoxifying stuff that can have a huge impact on the toxicity of these things. And talking too about allergies, fungal allergies are generally pretty rare. I think when I looked it up, so 1% to 2% of people can experience some discomfort when you eat mushrooms, and it's usually like pretty mild, like swelling of the lips, maybe a little bit like discomfort of the tongue, scratchiness of the mouth. Occasionally people will have like a little bit of like a skin rash or some flu-like symptoms, or GI upset, which is probably the most common thing you get from eating mushrooms, is your stomach feels a little bubbly, or like you have a little bit of a cramp or stomach ache, or worse, you throw up or have diarrhea. But you can occasionally get full like anaphylactic shock from consuming a mushroom, although when I was looking it up, it seemed that was really only likely for people who already had really severe like mold and kind of fungal spore allergies. And so allergies to spores are far more common. People, like 10 to 30% of people can have an allergy to spores. And that's not that surprising, because lots of people have allergies to like pollen and stuff too. And so lots of tiny things that present antigens that hit your nose and your lungs can cause issues. And it shouldn't be that surprising that people's immune systems kind of react to that stuff. But if you have a really strong reaction to molds and spores, then you're more likely, in some sense, at least medically, it seems, to have a reaction to eating fungi. And it does seem like if you have a reaction to eating fungi and eating mushrooms, even if it's a relatively mild reaction, you should be really careful about avoiding it, because it can cause bigger issues later on. Although what I will say, and I'm not a doctor or an allergenist, but what I've read, and being a PhD biochemist, is that a lot of allergies come from people not getting exposed to stuff, and then their immune systems kind of over mounting a response to an allergen when they're exposed for like the first time, or they have a rare exposure. And so if you eat a fairly diverse diet, if you get exposed early, if you let your kids play in dirt and get some spores and stuff on them, they're going to be a lot less likely to have weird allergies as they grow up. But again, some of these things can be part of your familial history, and they may be very dependent on like what your mother ate during pregnancy. Were you breastfed? What is your microbiome? The stuff about how allergies present and change over time too, because sometimes people are really sensitive as kids and then they're not so sensitive as adults, or vice versa. You can develop an allergy in adulthood that you never had as a kid. Depends a lot on your exposure and your health history. And I think the important thing there is just to be cautious and careful if you know you do have a fungal allergy, and be upfront and honest with your friends and family and help them understand where you're coming from and what your sensitivities might be. And to remember as well, like, just because you might be allergic to one mushroom does not mean you're allergic to all mushrooms, because they're very different. They have different components, and some of the things that are sort of specific about being an allergen in like a shiitake aren't in other mushrooms, or maybe they are in some other mushrooms but not all other mushrooms. And so in that sense, you don't necessarily have to be like deathly afraid of trying other stuff, just because you've been maybe allergic to like one kind of fruit, like a mango, doesn't mean you necessarily need to avoid all other kinds of fruit. You'll try other things and figure out what works for you and what doesn't work for you. So, in that sense, I think having an allergy doesn't have to be debilitating. It can just be a reason for you to be kind of cautious, and that's always good anyhow when you're approaching eating wild mushrooms because, like I'm about to talk about, there's a lot of reasons to be cautious, and there's a lot of things that can really mess you up if you're not careful. So, I'm going to go into some of the toxic effects that mushrooms can have on you. These toxins I mentioned, proteins, amino acids, alkaloids, organic acids, carbohydrates, hydrazines, fatty acids, all this stuff can affect your like brain function and neurotransmitters. It can even cause like brain damage depending on, like I said, the viability of your kidneys and liver to process some of these toxins. They can cause very severe liver and kidney damage, and that's kind of what the amatoxins do. And that is really bad because you sustain very serious organ damage to your livers and kidneys. There's not a lot they can do for you. You might have to be on dialysis the rest of your life, or get a liver transplant, but that kind of thing is very impactful. You can damage your GI tract, so the actual like physical lining of your GI, your intestines, your stomach. You can very seriously impact the microbiome too in a negative way by eating some of these things that aren't good for you. Some of these mushroom toxins can affect your heart, your blood pressure. They can be hemolytic, so they can kill red blood cells. They can poke little holes in membranes and cause all sorts of weird things to happen with your blood and heart function. They can cause an overactive immune response, and that's part of what sort of the allergic response to stuff is. But some of these things are, for good and bad, can be immune modulators and change the way that your body is reacting to different molecules and different organisms. And so that's a thing to be aware of. Again, there's good and bad in all of this. They're just sort of like the mushrooms are doing this agnostically for themselves. They're not worried about how it impacts our systems, but we as human beings need to be very aware of what we put in our bodies and the possible health consequences of that. Some of these mushroom toxins can cause really severe DNA damage and act as carcinogens. And they'll do that by changing the redox chemistry and potential inside of a cell and kind of stealing electrons and creating free radicals and generating cascades of things can lead to severe DNA damage or mutations, which then require a sort of a mounted immune DNA repair response within your cell to deal with this stuff. But if those toxins are continuing to hang around or persist because our body's unable to detoxify them or get rid of them, that's when you can really incur some serious damage. They can damage your muscles and cause like reduction of muscle tissue and again production of free radicals that can lead to other problems. It can also like affect your breathing and your lungs. I mean, pretty much everything about our human systems. We are just tender little bags of meat and muscle and flesh, and if you start throwing too many weird molecules and chemicals in there, you can really disrupt our equilibrium. And so this is why it's really important to understand what you're doing if you're mushroom foraging. But I will say, you know, on the overall spectrum of mushrooms, there's like 14,000 catalog species. There's probably upwards of more like 40,000 species of mushrooms on this planet. There's probably 200, 300, 400 really good edible species, and there's probably like 100, 200, maybe 300 really toxic species. And everything else in between is just a mushroom. So like most mushrooms aren't something you really have to worry about. And I usually tell people that they can touch most mushrooms without really any concern. Although I will say, if you have a mushroom allergy, there are types of dermatitis, skin rashes, and things that can occur from touching fungi, although it seems somewhat more common with molds than it does necessarily with fungus, or with mushrooms particularly. But, you know, it's a good reason to like wash your hands when you get home. If you're out in the woods touching mushrooms, you don't need to like stick them in your mouth. Don't stick them in your eye. If you really want to, you could always like wear gloves when you go out on hikes and want to touch stuff. So there's steps we can take everywhere along the way to minimize the risk. You know, I smell mushrooms all the time, but if you think you might have a real sensitivity to spores, like maybe don't smell the spores, there's things we can do to kind of make it safer for us. And I don't mean to be cavalier when I tell people that for the most part they can touch mushrooms. I'm just also really aware of all the mycophobia that exists towards mushrooms, and by trying to get people to be a little less afraid of mushrooms, I think, it will help them care more about mushrooms, and then hopefully help them act as better stewards of our environment, and work to promote biodiversity instead of sort of wanting to kill these strange things in the soil, right? So when we think about the toxin type, and let's talk about the mitigation of things, we want to think about, is this toxin heat liable? Like, is it stable? If we cook it, will it get detoxified? And there's a lot of toxins that are destroyed by heat, or at least broken down to the point that they're not problematic if you cook them. Are they volatile? And again, can you cook off this toxin? If it is volatile, should you be aware of like breathing it in as you're cooking it, because it might be not in the food anymore, but it might now be in the air, which if you're standing over the stove could be a problem. Is it dilutable? Can you like boil it out or mix it in with other stuff to the point that it's no longer an issue for you? And is it soluble, right? If you soak it in water, can you dilute it out? Is it soluble in fat? Depending on how you cook it or prepare it, there might be a safe way to do it, and there might be ways where it's not safe. Is it pH sensitive? There's a lot of questions here that you can kind of ask about the mechanism of toxicity and what kind of molecule we're talking about. And again, this is where I think I need to do like a second episode on this, because there's just so much depth and I can't possibly cover everything that I want to talk about. But I will talk briefly about some of the mushrooms that I've got here and I have some notes on. So talking about amanitas. Amanitas are probably the most famous toxic mushrooms. I've got some on my toxic mushroom poster. There are amatoxins in some of the most deadly amanitas. So these are the destroying angel, and the different species of that, as well as the death cap, Amanita phalloides. And in the Amanita phalloides, I believe there's also a whole separate class of phallotoxins that are similar to amatoxins, just slightly different peptides, and the organization of them is a little bit different. But there's at least 9 related cyclic amatoxin peptides. They're very stable, so they're sort of a big ring, and the heat, they don't get destroyed by heat. You can't dilute them out either, so you really, really do not want to eat these mushrooms, because they can kill you, and as much as like eating half of a death cap is enough to kill an adult human, potentially. And again, it depends on your kidney function, all this other stuff. But it can cause really severe organ damage, because amatoxins bind irreversibly to RNA polymerase II, which is the primary enzyme in your liver that is translating your DNA into RNA. And it's not just messenger RNA, it's also ribosomal RNA and other functional RNAs. And this amatoxin binds to this sort of bridge region of the polymerase that is really key to how quickly the polymerase moves down a strand of DNA, transcribing that DNA into RNA. And the amatoxin slows it down so much that the RNA polymerase usually can do like thousands and thousands of base pairs per second, and instead it's moving at just like a couple base pairs per minute. So it's a massive reduction in your body's ability to generate RNA, and then that leads to very severe kidney and liver dysfunction. But that toxin, these amatoxins, are not absorbed through the skin, so it's generally safe to touch these things. And they're present at very, very low concentrations in spores, and for the most part, it's not something I'd worry about breathing in the spores of like a deadly toxic mushroom, but I also don't intentionally breathe in the spores. And I've heard about people putting toxic mushrooms in their baskets accidentally maybe, and then removing them later, but some of those toxins getting into other mushrooms, or the spores getting onto stuff. So definitely be really careful with these toxic amanitas. Don't take any unnecessary risks. There's people out there who will like take a bite and chew it just to show you that they can like put it in their mouth and spit it out. Don't do that. That's a bad idea. Maybe there's some machismo associated with it, but like I wouldn't recommend it. It's probably just better that you don't. The minimum lethal dose for these amatoxins is like 0.1 milligram per kilogram, or about 7 milligrams in an adult. It can cause really severe headache, nausea, dizziness, GI upset, pain, flu-like symptoms. And again, usually what happens is there's sort of a delayed onset. So it's somewhere like, 6 to 12, 24 hours after you eat them, you get really sick. Then you get a little bit better. And then like 7 to 10 days later, you get really, really sick because your liver's sort of dysfunctioning and you die. It's not always a death sentence, but even if you don't die, you can sustain really, really severe organ damage. And it, does result in death, people who eat a good amount over, 25% of the time. So it's a pretty serious toxin. There is some sort of treatment available. A lot of it's really just like kidney dialysis, but there's some work that's going on with milk thistle treatment and psilocybin, something like that, that can hopefully chelate or maybe bind some of those amatoxins. And importantly, there's a new antigen test that's available you can buy over the counter called Amatox Test. And if you go to amatoxtest.com, I believe, you can order these antigen tests. It's sort of like a little pregnancy test. And you can just like take a drop you take a little mushroom flesh, mix it up with water, you put a drop on the pregnancy test, and it'll tell you positive or negative for amatoxins, which if you're worried about like your dog or your kids eating something in the yard, you can keep these tests around as a way to know whether, if you get a positive test, directly to the hospital. If you don't have a positive test, it's probably fine. You can wait around to see if the dog or kid is going to throw up after eating a mushroom in the yard, but it's not an amatoxin, so at least it's not something you necessarily have to go deal with. And amatoxins are scary because it's not just in amanitas, they're also in gallerinas, they're in lepiotas, lepiotas are pretty common mushrooms in like flower beds, and those in some ways scare me more than amanitas because people kind of know to avoid amanitas, but lepiotas can be mistaken by newbies all the time. They're fairly attractive, they're in big flushes. If you didn't know what you're doing, I could see yourself wanting to eat a lepiota. So again, recognizing the kind of morphology that goes along with these different species is really important. And I believe there's also a conocoby mushroom that contains amatoxins. And gallerinas and conocobes are ones that people can confuse when they're out hunting psilocybe mushrooms. So again, knowing the difference and knowing the particular morphology of the mushroom you're looking for is really important. So beyond the amatoxins, other amanitas that can really mess you up, there's Amanita smithii. And this is one I was talking about, had these amino acid derivatives, alenic norleucine, and I'm going to struggle to say this one, but stick with me, chlorocrotylglycine, something like that. So these are both things that are derivatives of amino acids, and they're part of the fungal metabolism as a secondary metabolite, but they can cause really severe kidney inflammation and can be deadly unless you get dialysis kind of quickly enough. And this is another one of those things that has sort of a delayed onset, and that's really scary to me because you could eat something and not just like realize that it was a problem until later. Amanita smithii is one that people confuse with Mycotoxins sometimes. So again, understanding the habitat and the particular type of mushroom you're looking for can help you avoid problems with that. Ibotenic acid and muscimol, that's what's in Amanita muscaria. This one is not actually particularly deadly toxic. I know that Amanita muscaria is always seen as being this toxic mushroom, but compared to some other amanitas, it's pretty benign. Ibotenic acid can make you have really severe GI upset and make you puke and have diarrhea, and is not a pleasant experience, but short of like throwing up so much that you end up like dehydrating yourself and dying, it's probably not going to kill you. You can decarboxylate ibotenic acid to muscimol through UV and drying and heat. And muscimol is a entheogen, which is a fancy way of saying it messes with your head a little bit. But it's a GABA agonist, and it can be a muscle relaxant. It can put you kind of into like a very sleepy state. It can make you have a little bit of kind of hallucination. It's a dissociative sedative, so it's not hallucinations like psilocybin, but it's like kind of an unpleasant, like if you took Benadryl and stayed up and were just like really woozy and tired. If you take too much muscimol, you can also end up in like a 72-hour coma. It's not something I would super recommend people try, but it is legal. So if you want to order dried Amanita muscaria, make a tea, you can do that. I think it's probably overpriced, but it's out there. And then there's muscarine, which is originally isolated from Amanita muscaria, thus the name, except muscarine is present at very, very low concentrations in muscaria, but higher concentrations in some other Amanita species, as well as some other Chlorocrotylglycine species as well. And that affects acetylcholine receptors. It can be very toxic. It's not one that I recommend that people try using as an entheogen, even though I think it has some purported entheogenic-like properties. But again, it can really mess you up if you have any issues with kidney or liver. It's just not something you really want to mess around with. Stay away from muscarine. And I think pantherina is one that people are always saying that they want to try. So yeah, just maybe stay away from amanitas in general until you really, really know what you're doing, because there are some very toxic amanitas that can absolutely mess you up, and that's not good. You don't want to play chicken with your liver and your kidney and your life. It's not worth it. So there's a few other kind of like, let's call them cute GI mushrooms. So there's the classic examples of like the Omphalotus, the jack-o'-lantern mushrooms. Those can make you very sick immediately. I have a sneaking suspicion that some of the compounds that are in there as well can be DNA intercalators, because they look like these big rings that could sort of slide right into DNA and cause torsion, twisting of the DNA, which over time, if you have chronic exposure, could cause some severe DNA damage. And so I have a sort of pet theory that these Omphalotus mushrooms are also carcinogenic, and it's another really good reason to avoid eating them. But there's also Clotospe nebularis, which can cause some pretty severe GI symptoms. But these things aren't necessarily known to cause liver failure, so this is like an acute toxicity. And maybe, like I was saying, the Omphalotus could have like a chronic toxicity element. I don't necessarily have a ton of evidence for that, but I have seen a few papers that kind of are leaning in that direction, saying that maybe chronic exposure to toxins in mice can cause cancer. So another kind of scary one that's in Cortinarius species, Cortinariaceae. I think that whole genus was just kind of like reorganized. I need to go learn about it to talk about it, because it was previously seen as the most diverse genus in the whole fungal kingdom, and now I think they split it up based on some DNA evidence. Those web caps are Cortinarius, but some of them contain a compound called orlanine, yeah, it's a bipyridine related to an herbicide called diquat, and it's really toxic. It disrupts redox reactions in your cell, causes massive amounts of cell damage. So again, it's changing kind of the chemical potentials inside of your cell and stealing electrons from certain things and causing whole cascades and things of damage to happen within your cell. But the symptoms are fairly slow to onset, so it's usually 2 to 3 days till you start feeling ill, and up to 3 weeks, and cause flu-like symptoms and some other very unpleasant physiological things. And there's no known treatments, but it does eventually lead to kidney failure, and the only real thing you can do is dialysis. So it's a good reason to avoid eating Cortinarius and webcaps in general too. There are some that are edible, unless you really know what you're doing, which is probably better to avoid them as a genus. There is something that is deadly, but is not necessarily that toxic depending on how you deal with it, and these are hydrazines. So monomethylhydrazine, geromethrin, is the kind of classic example, but agarotine is another one that's like relatively common, but agarotine is generally in agarics at very, very low levels. It's a phenethylhydrazine, and these things it's a small molecule, and it can act as like a neurotoxic convulsant or cause seizures, affects the central nervous system and cell signaling, and can be sort of toxic to like liver and blood and cause some really severe GI upset. And it can lead to death if you consume a good amount of it. So every year it's somewhat reported that people, there's a few deaths that happen, I think, in Europe and other places where people are consuming Gerometra species, although there are ways to process it that make it safe. And there's also some Gerometrin species that do not have a toxic amount of this mushroom, of this hydrazine. So there's Kaufmannii or Corfa. I think it's Gerometra corfa and Montana are like these big invaginated brain-looking Gerometra that are not toxic because they have very low levels of Gerometrin, and you can cook it off pretty easily in a pan like you would for a Morel. But the Esculenta and Infula, and there's some other parts of the Gerometra genus that have very high concentrations of this hydrazine, and even a double boil doesn't make me feel like you can remove enough the toxin that I'd want to try it. But that is a thing that people do. They take these mushrooms and they boil them 2-3 times to blow off that hydrazine molecule, because it is fairly volatile. But if you do this, you want to do it outside or in a very well ventilated area, because that toxin can blow off and right into your face and make you sick if you're huffing it. So again, you want to be really careful when you're working with stuff like this. I think in terms of the agaritine thing, I've read some reviews and papers that said there's really not enough agaritine in commercially cultivated agaricus by spores for it to be really any concern. But for me, I do always choose to cook my portobello and button mushrooms. I generally don't eat them raw at a salad bar. I probably won't eat them raw. I know some people really like them, and it's probably fine. If you really want to, you could always like do a marinade, some olive oil, salt and pepper, a little vinegar, that kind of thing to break it down. I don't know. Just be careful. Angel wings. This is a really cool looking mushroom. Kind of looks like an oyster mushroom. It's a Pleurocypella porrigans. There's these sort of skinny white looking oyster-like mushroom. They have a very different defined stipe, and the gills look different, and they're much thinner than a lot of than oyster mushrooms. But these have been known to cause really severe encephalopathy, brain damage, in people that have like poor kidney function or impaired renal function. And that's due to a mixture of unusual amino acids and maybe some toxic cyanide salts. The mechanism of toxicity there is still being figured out. Previous to that, this mushroom was considered edible, but if you have any kind of issue with your kidney function and other stuff, it's probably better just to avoid it in general. There's Chlorophyllum molybdes. This is a very, very common mushroom that grows on grass in the summer months all over the United States and all over the world. It's sometimes called the green spored parasol. It's a big, beautiful mushroom, and people are always curious if they can eat it because it's coming up on the grass. But if you see the green spores, because there's other related chlorophyllum species like Chlorophyllum morcoides, which has brown spores and is delicious, should still be cooked. But the Chlorophyllum molybdes can make you very sick. It's known as the vomiter, and especially if it's consumed raw. There's like 9 different steroid derivatives, a couple like 2 different alkaloids, this methylglyceric acid. It's got a bunch of stuff in it that can make you very sick and vomit and have diarrhea all over the place. And the symptoms are pretty quick onset, like 1-3 hours, so it's an acute one. And yeah, you just avoid the green spored parasol. I did read that potentially you could mitigate these toxic effects by like cooking and boiling it and cooking it multiple times. But, you know, if there's enough other good mushrooms around, why bother with something that's like inherently kind of toxic? I don't know. But speaking of edible mushrooms that can be toxic, shiitakes. Lentinula edodes. Raw shiitake can cause pretty severe dermatitis rash if you eat it, or like undercooked shiitake. And this is the thing, sometimes people make shiitake jerky and they don't think to cook it before dehydrating it. And that's a really important thing to do. I've talked to multiple friends who made a batch of shiitake jerky by just kind of marinating it and then dehydrating it, think that was enough cooking. It's not, and they ate a bunch of that jerky and they got really severe rashes. That got even worse with exposure to sunshine. And that's caused by this lentinin. It's a 1,3 beta-glucan carbohydrate that just wrecks your immune system because it's like an immune modulator and can cause like a rash to form. Shiitakes also have a lot of like lectins and small peptides, but can cause some issues, as well as a good amount of ergothioneine. But all these things can generally be mitigated by cooking. But there are some people who are like hypersensitive to some of these compounds, and cooking doesn't necessarily destroy all of those things. It can just knock down a lot of it. And so if you are hypersensitive to certain types of these compounds, then maybe these mushrooms will be more triggering of an allergic response, depending on your health history. And there's oyster mushrooms, which are very, very common, great edible mushrooms, but you don't want to eat them raw. They contain osteolysine, which is this pore-forming protein. So a bunch of these proteins can come together and kind of bind on the surface of a cell and create a little hole in the cell, basically, and then that can like kill the cell, essentially. It's probably like a defense protein that oyster mushrooms make, because oyster mushrooms are interacting with a lot of different fungi and nematodes and bacteria and all sorts of stuff. And so this is part of their like immune defense system. But these proteins, which are heat liable, so if you cook them, they go away. But if you're eating raw oyster mushroom, these proteins can have like hemolytics, so they can kill red blood cells, they can slow your heart rate, they can mess with your blood pressure, and just kind of affect your overall heart health. So while mushrooms in general are going to be pretty good for your heart health if you're cooking them and preparing them the right way, if you're eating things raw or not taking the necessary steps in preparation, you might be causing issues that you otherwise didn't know were there. So anyhow, that's just my kind of overview of mushroom toxicity and allergies and intolerances as it, the best thing you can do when it comes to eating mushrooms is to stick to mushrooms that are well known as edibles. It's to cook them well. If you're trying a new mushroom for the first time, always just try like a small bite and wait an hour or two, see how you feel. If you feel okay after a couple hours, maybe eat a little bit more and then wait like a full 24 hours. Make sure you don't have any like gurgliness in your stomach. Make sure you don't have any like flu or trouble breathing or, just keep an eye on your health, see how you feel. And, even if you do feel robustly confident about eating a mushroom, it's never a bad idea to not eat a ton of it. Limiting your portion size to like half a pound or pound. You don't need to eat a full like 4 pounds of chicken in the woods when you find it, because a lot of these things that can cause mushroom allergies or toxins are dose dependent. So it's also a good idea that if you're eating mushrooms to really only eat like kind of one mushroom at a time until you're pretty sure how different mushrooms will affect your system, because you really want to be careful about, some of these interactions or just what your body's dealing with. You throw too many antigens at yourself at the same time, you might have a weird reaction. So I do love making mushroom medleys, but generally only with mushrooms that I'm very confident in the fact that I can eat them all and feel good about eating them without having any hesitation. So as always, be careful. Don't eat anything you can't identify. Take the time to recognize stuff. Poisonous mushrooms aren't necessarily going to jump out at you. There's no special colors. There's no like rule of quote unquote thumb that you can follow to recognize poisonous stuff. You just have to learn what's edible and what's poisonous one by one. So take your time. Don't rush. You've got all the time in the world. And what they say is there are old mushroom hunters and there are bold mushroom hunters, but there are no old, bold mushroom hunters. So be careful, be cautious. The deliciousness of mushrooms will still be there for you. Just make sure you know what you're doing before you get really deep into eating too many of them, because you can really mess yourself up. So that is my podcast for the week. I'll be back next week with more fungal facts, and haven't totally decided what I'm going to talk about, but I have a few things on my mind. And feel free to email me, fascinatedbyfungi@gmail.com, if you have other stuff you want me to cover or questions for me. I'm going to be leading a foray on June 3rd and 5th up in Pollock Pines area to go morel hunting, and it'll be sort of a luxury weekend of very special food, hanging out with me, special lectures, all this kind of stuff. So we're still looking for a couple of couples to buy into this and come with us. These spots won't last long, so please hit me up if you're interested. Follow me on all the social media. I've got a YouTube, I've got a TikTok, a Pinterest, a Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all those things. If you'd like to support me and you want to see updates from my book or request recipes from me, because I know people like my cooking, you can subscribe to my Patreon. And if you check out my website, fascinatedbyfungi.com, I've got some cool t-shirts. I've got other kinds of original merch like mugs and leggings and puzzles, etc. There's an About Me page where there's more media that I've been involved in. There's a mushroom discount page too, where you can get save some money on mushroom grow kits and stuff like that. So anyhow, wishing you guys a great week and sending you much love until next time. Bye-bye. This has been the Fascinated by Fungi podcast.